the border. There's 11 points of the border between Mexico and the States where the US government sends people back. However, there's also a reception center at Mexico City Airport. And there's a special gate, actually, which is the Sala N, where people get, like, deportees get out of. And there's 3 flights every week with 135 people. So that's like 450 every week that get to Mexico City. Here's one person who just got deported, and he's like getting out of the gate. So what happens when they get there? Most of them have been in detention for a pretty long time, between 6 months and 2 years, even if they didn't commit any crime. So they get detained in the States, they stay in detention for a pretty long time, with very little access to the outside. And then they get thrown to Mexico City. Many of them are not from Mexico City. Most of them have not lived in Mexico City, even if they're from Mexico City, for a very long time, right? So they get to the airport, and I went to the airport, right, a few times. And so like there's like family members there waiting for them, for some, right? But then others don't have anybody. So they just get there and they don't know, they don't know the language, some of them, right? They've lived in the States, or they came to the States when they were 3 or 4. And then they get deported when they're adults, and they can't even speak Spanish. So that's one of the things, like that's one of the things that I observed. I didn't interview anybody at the airport, right? Like that's not the right place to do it. But it was still an interesting observation. Something that's really fascinating is that there is now a part of Mexico City that they themselves call Little LA, and more people in Mexico City are starting to know it as Little LA. And Little LA is this area around this monument that's over here, where there's around 20 call centers. And those call centers employ people who just got deported, who speak perfect English, and who are looking for a job. So these call centers, some of them employ up to 8,000 people. And there's around 20 around there. So you're just walking around the city and you hear people speaking English. And it's really fascinating. That area is just amazing. And I didn't know that. I mean, I knew that there were many call centers around there, but I had never experienced being there. Oh wow. According to this, I've been talking for 11 minutes and 22 seconds. Okay, I need a few more minutes.
So many.
Because it hasn't been
so much therapy to do this.
So the other thing is that there's like organizations of returned migrants that actually have got together with one another. You've probably seen news about these, like some are making t-shirts and that's how they're living. But basically they're creating networks of returned migrants and they're really helping each other out. So basically they're their support for one another. They're actually really amazing, and through them is that I could reach the more than 90 people that I've interviewed. And they're pretty much the only ones that are doing something for the returned migrants. Yeah, let me talk a little bit about this, kind of like the government part of the bureaucracy part. Some of the thing that's happening a lot is that people go back without an identity. By identity, I mean like a legal identity. So as I said, many of the people that I've interviewed came to the States when they were kids. Many of them were not originally from Mexico City, although they're living in Mexico City right now. And they came to the States without even a birth certificate. And they grew up in the States until now. So they get back to Mexico and they don't even have a birth certificate. Even less, they don't have any kind of ID or a passport. And without an ID in Mexico, you can't do anything. You cannot do anything. Like, you can't get a bank account, you can't receive remittances from the States, you can't do absolutely anything. So that's a really big problem. But related to that, there's other things. And then something that's ironic is that, at least from the Mexican side, there's a Trump effect which has actually made the Mexican government do something about these people. So when before, there was very little that was done for people who got deported. Now at the border, so many of the people that I interviewed actually got deported not all the way to Mexico City Airport, but they got deported first to the border, and then they ended up in Mexico City. And now there's actually like very well-established reception services for these people. So that little bag of food, right, is part of that. Reception services are just basically they give them some food, they register them, and that's pretty much it. But that didn't, not even that existed before. So yeah. So I guess that's all I'll talk about right now. But I'm looking forward to the questions.
Right, thank you. That was good. I'm really glad we got that on tape.
Yeah.
That was really great. Thank you. Well, I have some questions, but I'll defer to others first.
I just have a quick one for Rodrigo. How do they determine which migrants are being sent to Mexico City and which ones to the border?
That's a good question. Some of it is random, some of it is not. So if you say that you're gonna go somewhere that's like from the center of the country south, the US government tries to send you all the way to Mexico City, basically because in their point of view, it's a way for people to not go back to the States so quickly, right? So as opposed to just leaving you right on the border, if you're from southern Mexico and they bring you closer to home, they think that it's an easier way to not get back. But along the border, it's been changing a lot. So the US government actually has this kind of like strategy of deporting people through different points because they've noticed that the coyotes change their smuggling services really quickly and adapt them. So like in different years, they'll deport more people to different areas of the borders to kind of like at least disrupt a little bit of the business of the coyotes. It doesn't really happen very much. Like, the smuggling networks are still pretty strong, but they try to like move people around more. So it's a little random.
Yeah. I have one question for María and for Rodrigo. Congratulations to all of you. Great presentations. First, it's interesting to know how are you dealing with the idea of the popular, which is close to the idea of the assembly, in terms that the idea of the popular is different, I guess, from the United States and the Argentinian case, where the popular has a very strong tradition linked to, some the Peronismo and the National Popular projects. And also, I don't know if you are familiar or you're dealing with this idea of the popular sovereignty with, there are like some literature about how all these assemblies actually are reshaping the idea of democracy, but also the power of the people. So the popular and the people comes together, I guess, that's what I have seen. So I'm curious if you are going through this idea of the popular. And for Rodrigo, you have the question of at what extent does your research will challenge the idea of the return? Because if you were in the U.S. when you were 4 years old,
Yeah.
you are not actually returning. So you are being
Displaced.
initiating a process of immigration. And also there was this some common idea, I guess, in some literature, which I'm more familiar with, is for the Ecuadorian case, of course. The idea that the return has that migration has like a cycle process, a cyclical process, which concludes with the process of return at some point. Given that the moment that some immigrants starts the decision for going, abroad, there is implicit the idea that at some point they will return, either more temporarily, or they will return definitely at some point. But this works like that the return actually close the process of migration or not. Regarding to some of the, after the European crisis, the effects of the economic crisis in 2010, most immigrants from Ecuador and Peru and Bolivia, they were deported to these Andean regions, but they came to these Andean countries in order to go to the United States. So it is changing the process of migration where transnational networks were already built, right? So in that sense, in those terms, these social networks that you mentioned are also transnational. So it's not only the international networks that they have already in Mexico, but the ones that are still here.
Why don't we take more questions instead of having them go one by one?
Okay, I have one question for Vanessa. So, like in one of my past works, I was also trying to use this concept of everyday resistance. I don't know if you were using James Scott's. So I don't know if you can address a little bit like the way you were using that in your project, because now I'm a little bit familiar with the criticism of everyday
life.
resistance practice. So I don't know if you have contested that in your project. And I am in education, so I am a little bit curious of how the education system works in that community. So if they are, if the teachers there are speaking Nahuatl, if children there are also forced to adopt Spanish, and how it.
I have a question for Eric. Well, two questions. So I want to know why you decided to work in Colomba at the first moment. Like, you show the map and the coffee regions in Guatemala are pretty well extended, so I want to know what was the rationale behind the site you chose at the very beginning. And then at the end, you also mentioned that DESGUA mobilized the discourse of development, and I was wondering how do they envision that discourse? Because we know that this is a very much multivariant discourse that a lot of different actors embrace at different moments. So I want to know what kinds of legacies and what kinds of projects do they envision under the label of development?
I also have a question for her. So I wonder how. Well, yeah, these are very specific questions. Is DESGUA related to, since they see themselves as a development NGO, how are they related to these big funders, USAID, other big international funders that are part of the international capitalist system, and how do they talk to them? And then, what's their relationship, and how do they see themselves in relation to the tourism industry in Guatemala, and then to other similar small projects that are trying to reintegrate people who are migrating, who are returning from the States? Because there's a few. Actually, in Central America, there's a lot more of like these grassroots organizations, compared to Mexico at least, that are trying to do something with returnees.
You guys need to talk to one another. Yeah.
For Vanessa.
No, yeah.
We actually live together. Go ahead. I had never seen a presentation of your work. Actually. I don't know we live together. So when I heard the video, when I saw the video, heard it. I don't know if this is my imagination, but I heard some words in Spanish, and so I was wondering how that code switching operates in terms of their strategic use of like grammatical forms. If it plays any role or not. Yeah.
Should I answer right now?
Okay.
No, let's go in order.
Okay, good, but then I'm going to ask him to, wait, Julie,
Just have one for Vanessa after I.
we might never get out of here.
After I listen to Anna. So you said that a lot of men migrated for labor, and that women were in charge of the cargoes. So I don't know. I would like you to speak a little bit more of how that is reconfiguring power relationships within the communities.
Yeah, that was my question to you too. Actually, how is that reconfiguring the cargo system even? Not just gender relations, but how, there's certain things that are very much, certain cargos that are very that
Male.
assume, male physique and so on. What is that, leading to that? I'm gonna do my questions, and then if there's anybody else, did you have another?
I did have a question, although I won't be able to stick around to hear the answers, so maybe I'll just follow up with, it's for Eric a little bit later. I'm happy to share it.
You can ask the
Yeah.
question then, yeah.
Okay, well, but I have to leave in a couple minutes, so if I don't hear it, we could catch up later. But it's...
We'll let him answer.
You could let him answer and report back to me?
We'll let him answer before I ask my question.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so it's kind of related to Rodrigo's question and also my own research on smaller international NGOs in Guatemala and this idea of hacked and the tension around being hacked and them hacking but also being hacked, but deciding or discussing whether or not being hacked is actually being hacked, or when does appropriation of being hacked begin and end. You know what I mean? So I would imagine that there are groups that are also trying to take advantage of Desqua's work, while at the same time they're trying to take advantage of these transnational flows of resources, volunteers, et cetera. So I'd be curious to hear about how they define being hacked.
That was my question too, to say, that there's a polyvalence to hacking. Not just a polyvalence, but there's so many different ways in which actual hacking can happen. That I think it's really potentially really generative, as I said, I think in writing, to use the term, to develop it as a concept, but it'd be interesting to hear you say a bit more about it. So if you all don't mind, we can let him answer.
Sure.
So that our friend can leave with
Catch the bus.
satisfied.
So, to be honest, I haven't done a lot of thinking about this other angle of Desgua being hacked. So, I guess my first thing that I would think about was who is hacking them? And I think there's a couple ways you could think about this. So, is this local producers of fair trade hacking into the Desgua network to sell the bags they're making to a bunch of gringos coming through Shayla? Or is it these international groups of people from the U.S. coming down there? Are they hacking Desgua by somehow feeling better about themselves by going to this lunch and hearing about the realities of contemporary Guatemala? But I think that's a very important distinction. So, and yeah, there is no clear beginning and end, right? It's a continuous process. So that's very useful. So thank you for bringing that up, and yeah, it's something I'll definitely be thinking
It's
about.
like favela tourism, right? The idea that these people that go to visit the poor will work with the poor on their vacations. I've always thought that was a really bizarre thing to do. Lots of Americans apparently do it. Often linked to churches and whatnot. Okay, so my question was kind of related, and we have time to talk about it. Rodrigo, I was curious not only about the transnational dimension that I think is interesting, in terms of circuits and whatnot, but the fact of the matter is that in lots of places like Ecuador, Brazil, and so on, there's a whole sort of cottage industry about reverse migration now, right? That doesn't always think of it as transmigration. And so, I wonder where the trans comes in your analysis in that sense. That, in addition, I think it's really smart to have a subset of people that you're looking at who went back to places other than Mexico City. But it might be, over the course of just between now and when you finish writing, to keep track of the people you interviewed and see if, you can figure out any that may have tried to return or if in fact returned and whatnot, and what happens to them. Because I think that and I think an interesting source of thinking about that is the Puerto Rican experience, of course, which is a nation that is, constitutively transnational. And then Ana, I wanted you to venture a couple more thoughts on your takeaways and just speculatively say something about what's the difference between being an occupier and being assemblies, which was a very provocative kind of question to leave us on. So why don't we start in reverse order from how you spoke? So empezamos contigo y terminamos con él.
Well, that book of Scott was my main source when I started writing this. When I started thinking about my dissertation project, and this idea of the hidden transcript and public transcript really raised in my mind the question of if assemblies are are places where people use these hidden transcripts. And I don't think so, because they are just local people, and they deal with all the problems that the national society imposes over them. But definitely I'm really interested in this concept of everyday life resistance because, well, you know better than me, but all the work of resistance is pretty much focused on social movements and how resistance happens or takes place in public spheres. Whereas if there is less work on the everyday life resistance, because I guess it has to do with the difficulty of getting data about this, or it's not the same to observe dynamic in a family setting that going to the streets. I mean, methodologically and ethically, it's just different. And I think this is one of the contributions of my dissertation, that is gonna through qualitative data is gonna theorize around the everyday life resistance, because we don't know too much about it. But so far, I don't know, I haven't read any other work on everyday life resistance. I know that Scott is having a new book, but I haven't read it so far. In relation to the education system in Mexico, the primary school has been used to acculturate, definitely, like in many other countries in Latin America. And it's really interesting to observe the school dynamic because, first of all, teachers, rural teachers, indigenous teachers are sent to different communities than where they are from. And sometimes, most of where indigenous public system, they have teachers who are indigenous speakers, but they, for example, you have, I don't know, a Mazatec teacher in the Tarahumara area, so they are not in the places where they are supposed to be. And on the other hand, there is such a stigmatization and racialization of people through language that they don't want to show publicly that they are indigenous speakers. They have an indigenous language as mother language, and all the programs from the system is to purposely castellanizar. So this is one of the biggest tools in the country that has served to acculturation purposes. And for the code switching, there is a model to understand the linguistic contact that says that there is always like a matrix language that receives loans words and like elements from one language that is in contact with another, and it's pretty pragmatic, this model. The most interesting thing about this is to look at what are the functions of code switching and loan words, for example. In my master's thesis, my thesis was about code switching actually, and I observed that they use words like money. They have the word money, but they use dinero in Spanish, right? Even if the whole sentence is in Nahuatl, they use this lexical item because of the way of the word. So it's really interesting to see when they are doing code switching or they are using Spanish words. For example, in some assembly, the assembly was treating an issue on land issues with the neighbor community. And when they were talking about how the other community addressed the issue, they use Spanish because they associate the other community with the use of Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really the dynamic of switching is gonna give me a lot of insights on my topic, of course. And
allow me to just interject something. In terms of time, I'm sure that people have some constraints.
Yeah.
So let's try to be succinct, and I'll try to keep you succinct if you're not. But in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 minutes.
Okay. And I don't remember the other question of
Cargo and gender.
Yeah. Well, that change is happening, but a lot of power dynamic within cargo system is also happening because men they have to migrate, but at the same time they don't want to delegate power to women, right? But I think that movement of voices is what.
Don't they sometimes pay other men?
No.
Not in this case?
No, not in this case. They sometimes prefer to quit their jobs in the city than living the communal obligations, which is very interesting. But of course, women don't hold the main positions in the country. Not now, probably.
So thank you for that question about the popular. So you're totally right. Popular and popular don't mean the same, and el pueblo and the people don't mean the same. And
Sounds like
that's
a discourse lesson.
yeah, and that's something I definitely need to think about more. But in the meantime, I'm gonna say this. So there was a driving force in both movements against politics as usual. That is party politics and institutional politics. That force consolidated differently in different spaces. I think in Occupy it consolidated more strongly, where to the point where there was no, it consolidated early on and very strongly to the point that the General Assembly was not a space where any political party or even union or even any other organization could put forth their principles or sort of make it a mechanism for them to consolidate some sort of agenda. And that played out differently at the neighborhood assemblies in Buenos Aires, because they became such an important avenue and such an important popular force. I want to say that popular, instead of popular. There were very early on attempts to sort of I don't want to say co-opt, but more channel that force into party politics. And the way that played out was that it created very important ruptures by the mid-2002. And so many very large, strong assemblies kind of fragmented into the original neighborhood assembly, where they rejected all the people from the parties that wanted to sort of channel that force, and other assemblies that were still trying to sort of consolidate a project that was more akin to electoral politics. So in that context, that's kind of prefacing that in their rejection of politics as usual and party politics, there was also a rejection of peronismo and verticalismo. And so this is something also another kind of takeaway, interesting takeaway from the research, which is in order to understand where the horizontality, or horizontalidad comes from. For me, is an obvious metaphor that counters verticalismo, which is something that's very commonly used in political discourse in Argentina. And verticalismo is a spatial metaphor to speak about the politics of the way peronismo conducts politics, basically. So vertical structures of power. And so assemblies were very much against that. And so in that way, I think they were rejecting also that popular yet very vertical project politics that reflect in relation to the political history. So I don't know if I don't think that answers, but kind of addresses that. And the other question, the takeaways. So can I try this? Because I had something here from that line of thought. So I think that, so for instance, one of the takeaways, and to address that question with what it means to be an assemblist as opposed to an occupier, or like similarly. So I think I want to address that through the idea of horizontality and like how that means something different in different places. So equal participation within the movement was the mechanisms to achieve that were different. For instance, and I think what the huge difference and when I'm building up this kind of takeaway is that, for instance, in the U.S. there was a lot of attention to language use, and so you would and there were spaces of learning at the assemblies where more seasoned activists at the Occupy, where more seasoned activists were teaching people who were just starting to participate in politics for the first time. They were teaching them, like, listen, this is how you speak about this person, this is how you talk about this issue, this is, they were teaching them a particular language. And that language was very attuned to identity politics, and the particular tradition of thinking about race and gender and speaking about it in the US. And there were teachings about that in Occupy. Whereas in Argentina, there were teachings about what does it mean that, what is convertibilidad means. Like, what does it mean that suddenly we're going into dollars? What does that mean for my savings? What does that mean for my loans? What does it mean for my rent? They were teaching and they were having people participate in spaces of learning associated to economics, more than economics and class, more than gender or race. But again, that's an issue because race is not, it hasn't had the importance in mobilizing people and such movements in Argentina as it has had in the U.S. So it's kind of an unfair comparison that way. But this is all to say that equal participation was not achieved or attempted in the same way, or through the same mechanisms, even though they're speaking the same, a similar language of horizontality. And even though the horizontality comes from Argentina and is brought all the way up through the years, it doesn't mean the same. So I don't know. I'm responding to you, but that is your question. Actually.
That was my question.
Yeah.
But that's all right. You'll have plenty of time to talk about it.
Yeah.
All right, so I was answering both of your questions. So one of the reasons why I love the interviews is because they've given me really rich data. So in terms of the return migration being the end of the migration cycle, in the Mexico-US context, that has a long time ago, not even being considered. Because of US immigration policies, what was once a cyclic migration between Mexico and the US became a project of staying in the US very clearly for all kinds of people. However, I do think that in terms of return migration as the end of a cycle, or that kind of idea of what is migration and why are people migrating, comparing these two groups is really important, right? Because it's going to be, it might be very different from these two groups, because deportation is a clear disruption of any project that people had. Very aggressive, very clear disruption, whereas people who are returning by themselves without getting deported might have a much more complex idea of what their migration project was about and why are they returning. Now in terms of the transnational networks, so it's really fascinating. So and about the project, luckily at the beginning of the interviews, I asked everybody about their projects and about their reasons for migrating, or their parents' reasons for migrating, because many of them were taken to the States when they were very young. In terms of the transnational networks, this is really fascinating, and I think there's definitely going to be a paper later in my life that takes a look at that, but it's something that I shouldn't lose sight of, so I'm glad that you brought it up, because many of my respondents have I mean,
Family, children.
family, children, many of them are like mixed status families. So they have U.S. citizen children who stay in the States. Some of them have U.S. citizen children who went to Mexico and who are free to move back to the States whenever they want. So it's a really complex issue that really needs to get studied really in depth, because Mexico and the U.S. are so integrated now, and part of it is that there's 12 million people who have lived in. That's like 10% of the Mexican population has lived in the U.S. So if
Not
you
counting the percentage that was the U.S.
right, including the historic. So it's definitely like a big part of this that I need to really pay attention to. So I'm glad that both of you brought it up, so that I don't, so that I keep it in my head and I know.
But I think that the comparative literature. I mean, I remember when I went to Ecuador, que no me acuerdo la última fecha when it was precisely. I think it was like something like 2012, 2013. That they were all over Flaxo. There were there was a group working on reverse migration, and there was and then I know that a lot of the people who were working on, because the same thing happened in Brazil. People in fact started going back to Brazil and all of these places voluntarily,
Right.
when there was a commodity boom, when suddenly the economy, there were more jobs in Brazil than there were here.
Yeah.
Right? So people started going back to Brazil then, and then now they're starting to come back, right? Now they're starting to leave again.
Right, it's an interesting comparison. Also, there were, in Ecuador and Peru and Bolivia, there are programs where the two governments, like the Spanish government and the Bolivian government together, were bringing people back.
Right.
And we're providing certain kinds of programs and so on for people to return. So it's like a good it's a
Well, it might just be worth looking
good
at that literature.
to have an idea of that.
Yeah. Maybe precisely in your conclusion where you're going to map out what you do for the next 20 years of your life. Right.
So thank you, Julieta and Rodrigo, for the question. So why Colomba? So the map showed the different coffee growing regions, but they pretty much divide into the western and the eastern highlands on either side of Guatemala City. I believe the Western Highlands do have a higher volume of coffee production, and also the Eastern Highlands are known as being more mestizo. And in my original project, I was really interested in mapping how these changes are gendered, how they affect indigenous people differently. And the Western Highlands have a much larger indigenous population. And then kind of the more logistical answers, I also had access there. So I had this previous experience at the school that I knew was right beside these two communities. So that's why I went there. For how is development envisioned? So this is like I have some answers for this, but this is also something I'm still trying to tease out through my field work. I would say that development is envisioned as very much grassroots, as something coming from the local context. This group has no desire to interact with the Guatemalan state whatsoever. These people are Mayan, they're former guerrillas, they want nothing to do with the state. I would say development is also envisioned somewhat differently in terms of temporality, and that I think we assume that development is a very teleological thing, and I think they're very much trying to import these Mayan understandings of temporality. So development is not something that's reached. Instead, it's something that you do, and it has this different set of meanings. But this is a question, as I said, that I'm going to continue to ask, and I think that was productive for me during this trip to ask people, what's development mean to you? And I think I'll continue asking that. So how are they related to big funders? So this is a pretty young organization, only 8 or 9 years old. And I think there's a shift going on right now that's very useful for me to observe. So when I was there over the summer, they were filling out these applications with Oxfam, and everyone was really mad because Oxfam wanted a CV of the president. And they're like, this guy's a campesino, he's a campesino organizer, he doesn't have a CV, he's not making one for you, Oxfam. So at least at the very beginning, I think they were a little bit antagonistic to these big funders. I think they're now realizing that they have the ability to make themselves legible to these funders. It's a process of like learning legibility. Like how do we portray ourselves to get these people to give us money? They're certainly not messing with anyone as big as like USAID. And I think because of some of their backgrounds as former guerrillas, they don't think they'd even be eligible. They probably wouldn't be. In relation to tourism,
I would get money from USAID, and I'm not a former guerrilla, I mean, I wouldn't want money from USAID.
So in relation to tourism, so this is a source of funding as well. So Antigua is kind of the big city to learn English in Guatemala. It's where everyone goes. Shayla is where you go if you're like a cool backpacker who's too good for these tourists. So they're definitely like trying to tap into that, like come to our cafe, spend lots of money at Igual Mart. But I think what they're finding is at first the idea was that this is completely sustainable, but they're realizing that like even hipster backpackers are affected by the 2008 financial crisis.